Great animation is built upon a set of 12 principles, first developed by the pioneers of the medium at the Disney Studios in the 1930s. Many attempts have been made to explain or demonstrate these principles in isolation, but it's only through learning to combine them effectively that we can achieve the strongest results. To illustrate this, I'm going to explain the principles, whilst also demonstrating how I put all 12 into action during the creation of this penguin animation. Walt Disney Animation Studios have always been at the forefront of animation, but it wasn't until 1981 that a book was released which finally shared some of the magic behind their success. The Illusion of Life, written by two of Disney's top animators, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, included a chapter entitled The Principles of Animation, in which 12 principles were laid out, which, to all intents and purposes, have become rules of the trade at the Disney Studios. The first thing to realise is that these principles are not a checklist, and we can't simply tick them off one by one as we animate a shot. Instead, many of the principles are interdependent, and we'll keep returning to them throughout our animation process. With that said, for the purpose of demonstration, I've reordered the list of principles to roughly reflect the order in which they might typically be considered whilst animating, and the first one that we'll start with is staging. Every strong piece of animation begins with careful planning, and one of the first things to consider is the staging. Staging is a broad topic which relates to many things, but above all it's about clarity. How can we present our animation to the audience so that they clearly see what we want them to, when we want them to, in service of the overall story? Staging incorporates the use of the camera, where we place a character within a shot, as well as the acting choices that we make. With this piece of animation, I chose to show the penguin jumping onto the pile of rocks within a wide shot before cutting in to more clearly show his reactions. Obviously, this is just one of many possible options, and the animation could have been staged quite differently. Within a studio, the camera placement will usually be defined for you, and in this case, staging becomes far more about presenting your acting clearly. For example, ensuring that expression changes don't occur during fast movement will help the audience to spot them clearly. The key is simply taking your time to explore your options before you begin animating in order to ensure the strongest results. The next thing which I would typically consider during the planning phase of animation is the workflow which I intend to use. Straight ahead action and pose to pose are two common approaches to animating a shot, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. In a straight ahead workflow, you create a drawing or pose on frame 1 and continue frame by frame through until the end of the shot. This can be a very fluid way of working and is great for dynamic action shots, but can also be difficult to control exactly when certain actions will happen or where exactly you'll end up. In a pose-to-pose workflow, key poses are defined and timed out before extreme poses and breakdowns are added in between them. Once these are defined, the in-between frames are then added. This approach enables a shot to be planned out carefully so that everything happens when and where it should, although the results can sometimes be less fluid. The approach that you take will typically depend upon the needs of the shot, but it's worth experimenting to see what works well for you. I typically find that the ideal method, which is also the one which I use for this animation, is to combine elements of both approaches. Start with a pose-to-pose approach, before refining your animation with a straight-ahead pass. Now that I've decided how to stage my animation, and that I'll be using a pose-to-pose workflow, the next thing I need to do is to define my key poses. These will form the main skeleton of the animation, and I take my time to ensure that they're as strong as possible. When we're talking about 3D computer animation, it's easy to imagine that the principle of solid drawing no longer applies. After all, we have a 3D model to move around. However, the truth is, the final images which we're creating will be viewed on a flat screen. When we pose our character, we should think not of how it looks in 3 dimensions, but instead look at how it appears on the 2D plane of the screen on which it's being viewed. When seen like this, we can apply drawing and design principles to our character pose to improve its clarity and appeal. Whether you choose to think of this principle as solid drawing or instead as solid posing, all of the same techniques can be applied. Some key points to think about when posing your characters are silhouette, asymmetry, and line of action. Clear silhouettes enable poses to be quickly and easily understood. This is especially important with fast-paced animation. Asymmetric poses are almost always more appealing and dynamic than symmetrical ones, and they can be strengthened even further through the use of a strong line of action. A really important point to note here is that for any of this to work, it's essential to lock down the camera angle of the shot ahead of animating. If the camera is moved later on, it will break poses which have been carefully designed to work to camera. Once my key poses are defined and I start to create my extremes and breakdowns, it's very important to start considering anticipation. There are two aspects to consider when it comes to discussing anticipation. The first is technical, and it concerns the natural need to build up energy before something begins to move. For example, the penguin bends down to build up the energy required for the jump. And whilst this use of anticipation is essential in the creation of believable physical motion, anticipation also serves a valuable second purpose as a tool to cue the audience into what is about to happen on screen. If we're about to move something quickly, the more time that we spend building up the energy for that move, the faster it can be without the audience being caught off guard and missing what has just happened. Anticipation is therefore essential for both believability and clarity. Another principle which I'll always make use of whilst constructing my poses is squash and stretch. In The Illusion of Life, Frank and Ollie state that squash and stretch was by far the most important discovery that was made by those early pioneering animators. Before its use, drawings would be rigid and stiff, but by adding squash and stretch, a sense of flexibility was added, which gave the drawings a greater sense of life. Squash and stretch may often be seen as only relevant to a certain style of broad, cartoony, squashy animation. But in reality, squash and stretch can be used to varying degrees, depending upon the style of animation, and can help add a sense of weight or pliability to objects, as well as adding a greater sense of life and appeal. When considering the penguin jumping onto the pile of rocks, the whole body can be viewed as a single mass, which squashes down in anticipation before stretching up into the jump and squashing again upon landing. All of this helps to create a believable sense of weight. But squash and stretch can also be used in more localized areas, such as the head and face, in order to increase flexibility and appeal. Animation is a time-based medium, so obviously timing is going to be important. But what do we really mean when we talk about timing within the terms of these principles? When we refer to timing, we're talking about when things happen, how long it takes for something to move from point A to point B. So in the case of this ball, when we talk about its timing, we're referring to the number of frames it takes to move between the two extreme positions, the top and the bottom in this case. By adjusting the timing, we change the meaning of an action or create a different sense of character within that movement. An older character might move more slowly than a younger character, or it might relate to their particular personality. By adjusting the timing of our poses, we can create very different results, and by introducing variety into that timing, we can also add a feeling of texture and rhythm which enhance the overall appeal. If we then take our timed out poses and allow the computer to add a linear interpolation to them, we can create in-between poses for all of the other frames, but the result is very mechanical. All of the computer-generated frames are evenly spaced, and the animation doesn't look natural at all. This brings us to our next animation principle, slow in and slow out. Slow in and slow out, which may also be referred to as ease in and ease out, are really elements of a broader concept known as spacing. Timing and spacing are very difficult to talk about independently. For example, the timing is identical for all of these balls. It takes the same number of frames to move from one side of the screen to the other, but the results look very different. What is different in all of the examples is the spacing. So if timing can be thought of as when things move, spacing really refers to how they move. The further apart the images are, the faster the ball will travel. The closer they are together, the slower it will travel. And by adjusting exactly how we space those drawings, we can make something faster or slower within a given space of time. If we return to our previous ball example, you can see that both of the balls have the exact same timing, but by adjusting the spacing to slow in and slow out of that top position, we're able to suggest the effect of gravity overcoming momentum. So the ball slows as it rises and then accelerates as it begins to fall again. It's through the careful combination of timing and spacing that we can achieve believable and entertaining results. Looking again at our penguin animation, by adding some slow in and slow out, some acceleration and deceleration, we can create more believable and more natural movement. One thing that the computer likes to do is move things in mathematically perfect straight lines. Life, however, is not like that, and most things follow arcs as they move. If we bounce our ball across the screen, a linear path is very unnatural. By making use of arcs, we can create something more believable. If we also add in some squash and stretch, what's important to note is that the ball will stretch in the direction of travel along the arc of motion. Whilst I always try to build arcs into my poses as I'm blocking out a shot, it's only once the in-between frames have been added that we can really start to fine-tune and polish the arcs. Taking the time to do this will lead to a far more flexible and natural result. Technically, follow-through and overlapping action could be considered as separate principles, although they're closely related and both concern the creation of fluid, believable motion. Follow-through occurs when one thing drags behind another, and common examples are hair and clothing. As the head moves, the hair drags behind. When the head stops, the hair will keep moving beyond the head. Adding follow-through to the head crest of the penguin adds a lot of flexibility and believability to the final result. The faster the movement, the more the crest will drag behind, and there will also be more follow-through than there would be with slower motion. Overlapping action is the notion that things rarely start and stop moving together at exactly the same time. Again, looking at the penguin, I've adjusted the animation to ensure that the body, face, arms and head crest all start and stop moving on different frames, so their movement overlaps with each other. This is where using straight ahead animation over a previous pose-to-pose pass can be really helpful. This creates a far more natural result than the previous version without the overlapping action. Obviously in this case, part of the overlapping action is actually the movement of the head crest, which is also an example of follow-through. I've left the discussion of secondary action towards the end, since it's more of an advanced concept, but in truth it's something I would always consider and build in right from the planning phase of my animation. A primary action is the main action or story point of a shot, whilst a secondary action adds detail, believability and personality to the performance. In this example, our primary actions are jumping onto the rock pile, wobbling, and turning to react to the audience. Simply animating these elements would get the story across, but by adding in secondary actions, such as the nervous brushing of the crest, we add personality and life to the performance. Secondary actions should never distract or overpower the primary action or story point of a shot, but they can be used to add appeal, personality, and believability to a performance. At its best, animation is a caricature of life. Much as a talented caricature artist is able to capture someone's likeness through the exaggeration of certain features, the exaggeration of motion helps to add life and appeal. Believable motion doesn't have to be exactly lifelike, but can instead be an exaggerated version of what happens in life. Once again, exaggeration is one of those principles which I would consider right from the earliest stages of creating a piece of animation. But I'm discussing it here towards the end, since even when you have a piece of animation which you believe is working well, it can be worth revisiting it to see if you can exaggerate the poses, the timing or the spacing to achieve a more entertaining and appealing result. The one word you've heard me mention the most throughout this overview of the principles is appeal. I've saved a discussion of appeal until the end since I feel it's less of a principle and more of an elusive quality which we strive for in our work. It's what helps an audience to connect with and be entertained by a character, and can be seen as a combination of all the various elements which are pleasing to the audience. It's really through the careful application of the other animation principles, together with a solid acting performance, that we have the potential to create an appealing result. The thing to be aware of with all of these principles is that they're just that, principles, not hard and fast rules. You can think of them instead as ingredients in a recipe. Add them in the order and quantity which suits you. Different combinations will yield different results, and each will appeal to different tastes. It's only through repeated experimentation that you'll find your perfect recipe.